22nd September 1945. Bad Tölz, Bavaria. A requisitioned building, once the pride of the Hitler Youth, now serves as the headquarters of the American Third Army. Inside a crowded room, cigarette smoke curls beneath the lights, and a room full of war correspondents wait with pencils poised. At the front stands a general who has spent the last year making headlines for slapping soldiers, racing tanks across France, and threatening to drive to Berlin ahead of the Russians. Today, George S. Patton is not talking about tanks. He is talking about Nazis. And what he says in the next few minutes will end his career. A reporter asks him about denazification, the Allied program to strip former Nazi Party members from German public life. Patton, never a man to dodge a question he finds tedious, compares the whole business to a squabble between American political parties. It is, he says, rather like a fight between Democrats and Republicans. The room goes quiet for a beat, then the pencils move fast. Within hours, the quote is on the wire. Within days, it is in every newspaper in the free world. Within a month, one of the most decorated generals in American history will be relieved of his command in Germany. Not for anything he did on a battlefield, but for what he said and did not do in the peace that followed it. This is not a story about tanks or artillery. It is a story about paperwork, about bureaucracy, and about a soldier who had spent his entire adult life training for exactly one kind of war, discovering, to his fury, that the war he had actually won demanded a different kind of man to finish it. It matters because it exposes something uncomfortable about victory, that defeating an army is not the same as dismantling the system that built it, and that the man best suited to winning a war is not always the man suited to what comes next. 4 months earlier, the same general had stood in a very different room. In mid-April, on his orders, roughly 1,000 men and women from the nearby town of Weimar were marched through the gates of Buchenwald concentration camp, forced to walk past the crematorium ovens, the pathology specimens, and the bodies of inmates who had died in the camp's final days. Liberated prisoners lined the route and shouted back at the townspeople's protestations of ignorance. It was Patton, more than almost any other American commander, who had insisted that ordinary Germans could not be allowed to claim they had not known. And yet, by that September afternoon in Bad Tölz, the same man was standing in front of the same press corps, arguing that the effort to remove the political machinery which had made Buchenwald possible was being carried too far, too fast, and with too little regard for the practicalities of running a defeated country. The contradiction sits at the heart of everything that follows, and it does not resolve easily. To understand why a press conference could end a legend's career, you first have to understand the scale of the problem the Allies inherited in the spring of 1945. Germany did not simply have a government to remove. It had a society that had been rebuilt brick by brick around the Nazi Party for 12 years. By the war's end, the party claimed roughly 8 million members, a figure that meant in practice that almost every doctor, teacher, judge, railway clerk, and factory foreman in the country had, at some point, signed his name to it. Membership had not always meant devotion. For many, it had meant keeping a job, keeping a ration card, keeping a child in school. But the Allied planners in Washington and London did not have the luxury of parsing conviction from convenience. They needed functioning courts, hospitals, and utilities in a defeated country of roughly 70 million people, and nearly every man qualified to run those institutions had a party card in his file. The policy that emerged, laid out in a directive known as JCS 1067, was blunt by design. Military government detachments, scattered across the American zone, were ordered to remove anyone who had held even nominal Nazi affiliation from positions of authority, and to do it quickly using a questionnaire, the Fragebogen, that ran to more than 100 questions about a person's political history, financial standing, and party activity. On paper, it looked tidy. In practice, it meant that the only qualified engineer keeping a town's water supply running might have to be sacked on a technicality, while the town itself sat amid rubble, short of doctors, short of food, and increasingly resentful of the men enforcing the rule. Eisenhower himself, in a report on the occupation that same autumn, admitted as much. It was not easy, he wrote, for a local military government officer to dismiss the only waterworks engineer in his city because the man had once been an active party member. The decision had to be made anyway. That was the theory. Whether it could be made, town by town, hospital by hospital, was another matter entirely. And it was a matter that fell squarely into the lap of a man who had never wanted the job in the first place. The scale of the wreckage made the choice even harder. Bavaria in the summer of 1945 was a land of collapsed institutions. Courts without judges who had not been party members, schools without teachers who had not signed the same forms, hospitals struggling to keep even nominal staffing levels amid a refugee crisis that saw hundreds of thousands of displaced persons, freed forced laborers, and fleeing ethnic Germans from the East pour into a region already stripped of housing and food. Roughly 2 million people were, by some estimates, moving through or settling in the American zone in these months, placing enormous strain on precisely the civic infrastructure that denazification threatened to hollow out further. An occupying army trained to destroy things now found itself responsible for keeping trains running, prisons secure, and typhus from spreading through refugee camps, all while simultaneously being ordered to sack the very officials who knew how to do any of it. It was, by any measure, an almost impossible balancing act, and it is worth remembering, before judging the men who attempted it, just how few of them had ever been trained for administration of this kind. Patton had been made military governor of Bavaria in the weeks after Germany's surrender, a vast southern territory of ruined cities and displaced millions, and the appointment suited him about as well as a desk suits a racehorse. The man who had driven the Third Army from Normandy to the Czech border in under a year now found himself buried in requisition forms, denazification tribunals, and the sluggish, unglamorous work of civil administration. He was, by his own admission, not built for paper shuffling. He had a temperament forged for movement and confrontation, not for the patient, procedural dismantling of a defeated bureaucracy. And yet it was precisely that dismantling that Washington now demanded at a scale and a speed that no occupying force, however well organized, could plausibly deliver without breaking the country it was trying to rebuild. The mechanism behind denazification was, in its way, as intricate as anything the Third Army had used to break through the German lines. Field detachments, more than 140 of them across Bavaria alone, were tasked with processing individual Germans through a formal system of categorization, sorting the population into gradations of guilt, from major offenders down to nominal followers, each tier carrying different restrictions on employment and property. It was designed, in theory, to separate the ideologue from the conscript, the concentration camp administrator from the reluctant schoolteacher who had joined the party in 1938 because the alternative was unemployment. Running it required thousands of case files, interviews, and tribunal hearings conducted by American officers who were, for the most part, soldiers rather than administrators, thrown into a bureaucratic exercise on a scale their training had never prepared them for. Patton's skepticism was not simply personal irritability, though there was plenty of that too. He argued in blunt terms to his own staff and eventually to the press that removing every party member from public office would strip Bavaria of the very people capable of running it. More than half the German population, he pointed out, had been party members at some point. Purge them all, and you were not left with a functioning civil service, you were left with a vacuum, filled either by chaos or, worse in his eyes, by the political vacuum's likeliest beneficiary further east. He was, by this point, deeply and increasingly obsessively suspicious of the Soviet Union, and he came to see rigorous denazification less as justice than as a self-inflicted wound that would leave Germany weak and Europe unstable at precisely the moment American strength mattered most. He put the argument to reporters in his own characteristic terms. He was not, he insisted, trying to be king of Bavaria. He hated Nazis as much as anyone, he said. But the trouble with the purge as it was being carried out was that, in his words, the outs were coming around saying that the ins were Nazis, and more than half the German people had been Nazis at some point, so you would be in a considerable fix if you tried to remove them all in one stroke. Most rank-and-file members, in his view, had joined the party simply because it had, at the time, seemed the sensible thing to do, not out of ideological conviction. It was a defense that sounded reasonable enough in a briefing room and looked considerably worse in print, stripped of tone and context, sitting beside photographs of the camps his own army had helped to liberate only months before. What he did about it, rather than merely say about it, is where the story becomes murkier and more troubling. Investigations by Eisenhower's own political advisor, Robert Murphy, dispatched to Bavaria specifically to examine Patton's administration, found that the military government there had moved slowly, and in places barely at all, retaining former party officials in local posts rather than pursuing the aggressive purges Washington had ordered. It was not open defiance so much as a quiet, grinding, foot-dragging, the kind of institutional inertia that a general uninterested in the task could allow to settle over an entire military government without ever issuing a single order to obstruct it directly. Detachment commanders down the chain, many of them junior officers with no training in civil administration and no particular appetite for the political minefield of deciding who among their local contacts counted as a genuine Nazi and who, as a reluctant conscript to the party, took their cue, consciously or not, from the tone set at the top. Where Eisenhower's headquarters pushed for speed and thoroughness, Bad Tölz, under Patton, pushed back again and again for patience, exceptions, and practical accommodation. If you're finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know and costs you nothing. Patton's approach did not exist in isolation. Across the 4 occupation zones, denazification looked strikingly different depending on who was running it, and the contrasts are instructive. The Soviet zone in the east pursued its own version of purification, but one aimed less at genuine reckoning with Nazism than at clearing the ground for a new political order entirely, installing loyal communists in place of removed officials rather than pursuing the more painstaking case-by-case American model. The British zone, administering a population in the north, exhausted and half-starved after a brutal winter, took a more pragmatic, gradual approach from the outset, prioritizing the restoration of basic services over rapid ideological purges and quietly retaining technical experts where the alternative was administrative collapse. The French, controlling the smallest zone in the southwest, ran the most erratic program of all, hampered by limited resources and shifting priorities. Against this backdrop, the American zone's approach, at least on paper, was the most rigorous and systematic of the 4, built on formal legal categories and hundreds of thousands of individual case files. But rigor on paper is not the same as rigor in practice, and it was precisely the gap between Washington's exacting blueprint and Bavaria's messy reality that Patton's critics seized upon. He was not accused of being softer than the Soviets or the French. He was accused of failing to meet the standard his own country had set for itself, in the very zone meant to be the flagship of thorough, principled reconstruction. The consequences arrived quickly once the press conference quote went public. Eisenhower, who had tolerated a great deal from his most flamboyant field commander over the preceding 2 years, from unauthorized strategic gambits to the infamous soldier-slapping incident in Sicily, drew a hard line this time. He ordered Patton to retract the comments publicly, which Patton did, blaming sensational headlines and his own poor choice of analogy rather than any error of substance. It did not save him. Within days, Eisenhower relieved him of his post as military governor of Bavaria, reassigning him to the largely ceremonial command of the 15th Army, a posting widely understood by Patton and everyone around him as a professional dead end. The soldier who had raced across France now found himself, in his own bitter phrase, out of a war and out of a job, all without a single Soviet or German bullet involved. The historical verdict on what Patton's foot-dragging actually cost is more complicated than the press conference scandal suggests, and honest history has to sit with that complication rather than resolve it neatly. Formal academic assessments of the Bavarian occupation conclude that denazification there was, on the whole, considerably less successful than the parallel effort at democratic reform, hampered by contradictory aims that pulled in opposite directions, restoring political autonomy to Bavarians on one hand, while aggressively purging their institutions on the other. Patton's personal resistance was a contributing factor, but not the only one. The scale of the task itself, the sheer number of implicated citizens, made total success a near impossibility for any commander, however committed. What the program achieved, even where it fell short of thoroughness, was arguably more symbolic than administrative. It publicly and permanently stigmatized Nazism as a viable political philosophy in a way that quiet forgetting never could have, even as thousands of minor officials slipped back into public life within a few years of the war's end. Patton did not live to see how the argument was eventually settled. In December of that same year, he was gravely injured in a car accident near Mannheim and died less than a fortnight later, leaving his controversial final months as military governor permanently unresolved, a coda rather than a conclusion. He never got the chance to revise the record, to explain himself further, or to watch as denazification in the years that followed was steadily wound down across all the Western zones anyway, overtaken by the emerging priorities of the Cold War that Patton, for all the wrong reasons and in all the wrong words, had been among the first American commanders to sense was coming. What remains, 7 decades on, is not a weapon or a battle, but a genuinely uncomfortable question, and it is worth sitting with rather than resolving too neatly. The same instincts that made Patton a devastating battlefield commander, his impatience, his contempt for caution, his willingness to trust his own judgment over a written directive, made him, by most contemporary and historical accounts, a poor administrator of the peace that followed. He could see, with real clarity, that a punitive blanket policy risked breaking the very society the Allies needed to rebuild. What he could not see, or would not say plainly enough to matter, was that the alternative he offered, quiet accommodation with the old order, carried its own moral cost, one that a country only months removed from liberating Buchenwald was in no position to accept from one of its own generals. He was not, by the evidence, a man sympathetic to Nazism. He was a man who thought the reckoning was being conducted badly, and who chose, disastrously for his own career, to say so to a room full of journalists rather than fix it quietly through the chain of command. The building at Bad Tölz, where he gave that press conference, still stands today, a reminder that some of the most consequential moments of the 20th century did not happen on a battlefield at all, but in a room with a lectern and a few dozen reporters holding pencils. Patton won the war he was trained for. He lost the peace he was never suited to keep. And in the space between those two facts sits a lesson that has outlived every tank he ever commanded. That victory creates an obligation the victors do not always know how to meet, and that the loudest voice in the room is not always the wisest one to trust with what comes after the guns fall silent. Consider the two images side by side, because the documentary record insists that we do. In April, the general who ordered 1,000 German civilians to walk past the crematorium ovens at Buchenwald so that no one in Weimar could ever again claim not to have known. In September, the same general telling reporters that the effort to remove the political machine behind those ovens from German public life was being taken too far, at too great a cost to order and stability. Both moments were real, both were, in their own way, sincere, and the distance between them is not a contradiction that historians have resolved so much as one they have learned to sit inside, because it says something true about how quickly moral clarity can curdle into administrative fatigue once the shooting stops and the paperwork begins. He was, in the end, undone not by an enemy, but by his own certainty, spoken a beat too soon in a war that had already moved on without him. The tanks are in museums now. The Fragebogen forms have long since been shredded or archived and forgotten, but the question Patton's downfall left behind, whether a swift, sweeping justice or a slow, practical mercy does more to rebuild a broken country, was never really answered in 1945, and in truth, it has never been fully answered since.